Before I introduce the panel, I want to give just a brief overview on kind of where we're starting in terms of this discussion so that we kind of set the stage. Americans say affordable housing is a major problem where they live. Portland is among the least affordable metro areas in the country, as set out in the Bureau of Economic Analysis. By federal standards, a housing unit is considered affordable when it costs someone 30% or less of their income. As an example, Clackamas County, the census says the average median income is $88,517 a year. So the state of Oregon and local government have been making affordable housing production a top priority. Oregon has an affordable housing shortage of almost 140,000 homes across the state. Governor Tina Kotek issued 3 states of emergency related to housing this year, particularly Executive Order number 2304, called on the state to build 36,000 homes a year for each of the next 10 years. That's an 80% increase from current production. Affordable housing affects and impacts every business and person in this room. We each have or know of employees or colleagues who commute from farther and farther away for an affordable house or an apartment. And we run the risk of having those employees or colleagues become tired of that commute and look for jobs closer to their affordable home or community, which may reduce the talent pool locally. With affordable housing being so vital to the future of our region and industries, we wanted to hear from some professionals that are working on this problem day in and day out. Today we will discuss with them if we are headed in the right direction, whether we can continue this new momentum that we've picked up, and what can we do as businesses and community members in regards to affordable housing. So that's my setting the stage. I'd like to introduce this esteemed panel, starting with Erik Olson, who's sitting next to me. Erik is the long-range planning manager at the City of Lake Oswego, with a focus on housing policy and affordable housing. For the past several years, Erik has managed the city's work to adopt code amendments that comply with state middle housing requirements related to House Bill 2001, as well as an update to Lake Oswego's housing needs analysis. To Erik's left is Christine Lewis, a Metro Councilor who represents the communities of District 2, which includes a big group of cities, including Oregon City, Gladstone, Milwaukee, Happy Valley, West Lynn, Lake Oswego, River Grove, Johnson City, Southwest Portland, and unincorporated Clackamas and Multnomah counties. Currently, in her second term, Councilor Lewis's responsibilities and committee assignments span from housing and transportation to parks and nature, solid waste, and regional cultural venues. To her left is Preston Korst, who is the Government Affairs Director at the Home Building Association of Greater Portland. He manages the organization's political and public policy work at the local level, advocating across 6 counties and over 40 jurisdictions on issues that affect housing production and affordability. And last but not least, at the end, on the very left, your right, is Patrick Berry, who is an appraiser with Berry & Associates, a commercial real estate appraisal firm. Since 1983, his company has completed over 6,000 appraisals of multifamily properties throughout the Portland and Salem metropolitan area. So with that being said, let's give them a round of applause. I'm going to start with Good morning. I think we're going to start with, we're going to do this in 3 segments. We've got about 40 minutes. And first, let's start with the State of the Union, the state of things right now with regard to workforce housing and affordable housing in the area. There seems to be a lot of momentum in regards to affordable housing. Councilor Christine Lewis, can you give us an update on the progress toward new affordable housing across the greater Portland region?
Sure, absolutely. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for rising early after Halloween night to talk about the most pressing issue of our region. And coming from the Metro perspective, I have a lot of news to share. First, the update on progress of our 2018 housing bond. So in 2018, we as a region committed to building housing for those who need our help the most. Those folks with extremely low income. And many of them are working, making minimum wage, supporting a family, but still qualify for that deeply affordable housing. And next week, I have the opportunity to help open the 1,000th unit that has gone from design to construction to being fully open and somebody moving in. And that's at the Good Shepherd Village in Happy Valley. That is Happy Valley's first ever official affordable housing, like regulated affordable housing. So that is something to celebrate, not only for Happy Valley, but also for Clackamas County. The 2018 bond, we promised 4,000 new homes that would help stabilize over 12,000 individuals. With that bond, we are on track to surpass that goal. We think we're gonna hit 4,700 units. We're surpassing the goal because not only did we take advantage of selling the bonds in a pretty good market a few years ago, but we're also making smart use of our resources and really leaning in. Of those thousands of units, 812 are definitely committed for Clackamas, and 560 of those are already done. So Clackamas is getting our share of this regional impact. So saying that, we still have work to do, because that is only one portion. Regulated affordable housing is workforce housing as part of the solution, but housing affordability overall is beyond just building out a bond project or just building out affordable housing that is supported through bonds or other government sources. So when I think about how we get to that broader affordability, units that nurses and teachers and families like mine can live in, that's where I look to our urban growth report. Metro works every 3 years now through a land use cycle, and our urban growth report will be due next year. We currently have a roundtable of over 20 individuals who are helping us identify, we know we have a need for housing, but how do we actually put that into the form that is necessary given the land use regulations in our state. So as we explore new ways to fund deeply affordable housing over the next decade, I'm also deeply committed to rising in this moment and making sure that our next urban growth report is an accurate reflection of what we need in our region for new housing.
Thank you. Erik Olson, what is happening in the City of Lake Oswego in regards to affordable housing?
Thanks, Amy, and thank you all for having me this morning. Good morning, everyone. So, clearly Lake Oswego is a higher income community, but, that doesn't mean that we don't really acknowledge the critical importance of housing affordability here in that city. So the city has really picked up our focus on encouraging multifamily and affordable housing development in recent years over the past 5 years or so. There's a current council goal to really continue our work on those key initiatives, including a few affordable housing projects, as well as other sort of work that we're doing behind sort of zoning and other strategies that the city could be taking on to address our housing needs. But just in general, over the course of the last 5 years, the city's issued about 1,111 housing permits, and this is overall housing, not just affordable units, but 754 of those are multifamily units, so really kind of going towards that direction. Multifamily, and 32 of those are middle housing units. We've mostly seen accessory dwelling units for that type of middle housing construction in the city. The city's invested about $10.9 million for multifamily and affordable housing, including about $8.7 million in SDC waivers. So we've taken a number of actions as a city to promote affordable housing specifically. That includes some zoning specific sort of density bonuses and FAR bonuses within some of the districts in the city, our overlay districts. We also expedite permitting for deed restricted affordable units in the city. We waive SDCs and development review fees for affordable housing, generally at 80% of area median income or less, and for ADUs. So the city really has exempted about $388,000 in total just for ADUs alone, and like I said, we've provided about $8.7 million in SDC waivers total. We've also facilitated some zoning code changes to allow some mandatory inclusionary housing kind of in the Merrillhurst Commons and former Boones Ferry Road construction area staging sites. So we waived the fee to process the code change at Merrillhurst, and we processed that code change for the Boones Ferry Road site as well. So the mandatory inclusionary housing that we've mapped sort of in our zoning districts applies to those two sites, sort of Merrillhurst and Westlake Grove Special District. So we're aiming for, at least under the zoning, about 80% of area median income to sort of target for those units, though we do expect them to come in a bit under or more affordable than that. We use urban renewal funds to support affordable housing, particularly at the North Anchor property in downtown. We use surplus city-owned land. As I mentioned, the former sort of staging area site at Boones Ferry we've been using to work with Metro and Clackamas County on an affordable housing development there. So that site will be used to create 55 deed-restricted affordable housing units using the Metro Affordable Housing Bond funding. So, throwing out these numbers within the context of what Councilor Lewis was just talking about in terms of the overall context in the county. We also engage in public-private partnerships with organizations like Habitat for Humanity and Mercy Housing Northwest. We look to convert underperforming commercial assets in some parts of the city, including that North Anchor property, which was just that. And we utilize surplus land that's owned by faith-based organizations. As I'm sure some of you are aware, we employed that strategy through our work with the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary when they were considering reuse of the former Merrillhurst campus site. So ultimately we were able to reach an agreement, or actually the sisters reached an agreement with Mercy Housing Northwest to complete about 100 units of affordable housing out there. So generally, we're also out there advocating for affordable housing, securing ARPA funds to use for developing for sale affordable housing units. So there's about 4 projects in total that we expect to see constructed in the city that are currently in sort of various phases of completion, but we do expect to see in these 4 developments, including North Anchor, that Boones Ferry site, Merrillhurst, and the Habitat for Humanity site on Boones Ferry, a total of about 180 different affordable units in total. So really, those get at different levels of affordability. We can see, some of those will be at 30% AMI, particularly with the Hacienda awarded development out in Lake Grove, but all of those would be deed-restricted affordable units at 80% of area median income or less. So just kind of wanted to end my long plug here for just kind of pointing out that we've been doing a lot of work related to overall housing need in the city as of late. We recently adopted, or council recently adopted, housing needs analysis for 2023 that sort of shows that we have a deficit of about 642 units based on what we expect to see in terms of housing development in the city by the year 2043. So even considering that level of development and all these sort of affordable developments, we still expect to have a deficit of housing in the city. So I think it's all a plug to say we really would like you to get involved in the next stage of that work on the housing production strategy. Folks that are interested in kind of what we're doing here as a city, particularly those of you in the business community, we will have lots of opportunities to reach out and talk about different ways that the city can promote affordable housing and specifically workforce housing as well. So stay tuned on that, and hope to have a lot more progress in the next year or so.
Thank you. Let's see if this one on. Oh, maybe this one out. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you. Technical problems. Thank you for that, Erik. There's a lot going on at the city and the Metro. Preston Korst, what are your thoughts on the progress on affordable housing from the home builder's perspective? What have you seen work well?
Yeah, so I appreciate Councilor Lewis and Erik, your guys' optimism and the good work that your cities and jurisdictions have been doing. Certainly it is positive and we should be continuing in that direction. But such is my role in life, I get to sort of play the pessimist because the truth is we're staring at a housing deficit currently regionally. So I work regionally, so I try not to, when I speak about housing, speak in specific cities or jurisdictional contexts. I tend to focus on what the market says, and housing certainly is an ecosystem, and what is happening in one city is not necessarily always reflective of what's happening in another. But we're currently staring down a deficit in the Portland metro region of about 60,000 units. Those are units that we should have built yesterday. So that's currently the figure that we should all be staring at right now to get at where we need to be. Over the next 20 years, figures vary, but assuming for current population trends, we're going to need about 220,000 more units to be built over, by 2043. So we have our work cut out for us, and I would commend the fact that we are, as a society, prioritizing, subsidizing, and incentivizing direct affordable developments, which is great. But all things considered, I think the directly subsidized affordable housing production accounts for about 8 to 10% of the overall production of housing today. So while we should be prioritizing and focusing on that below 30% AMI, we really do need to be talking about, I think, where the most impact could be had, which is supercharging the actual developments that are happening at the market rate, because we should be saying, and this is what I'll say to every single person in the room, every time I meet anyone new, I say housing supply equals housing affordability. So the more production we can get out and build in all cities, not just, there's not one city. The city of Portland, while we build mostly there, I think that they take the brunt of all development. They still are not the only jurisdiction that should be focusing on their housing production strategies, which truly are they're going to be the bedrock of how future housing growth happens. And I would also mention, I know we're talking a lot about workforce housing. I will say that and this is a national study done by the National Association of Home Builders, for every one unit that we build, we're essentially creating 3 jobs out of that. So the more, so I want to also put into at least everyone's minds the fact that every time we do build a home, it's not a net decrease to a jurisdiction's tax base, based on how taxes are structured. I assume most of the folks know about Measure 50 and 5. The more we build, the more we are creating economic development in the city or in the region. So building is good, let's just say, and we need a lot more of it. That's the sort of how I describe my affordable housing goals.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes left in this section, so I've got a bonus question. I'll start with Councilor Christine Lewis and then open it up to anyone else who wants to add in. What are the ways that a lack of affordable workforce housing impact businesses in the Portland metro area specifically?
Yeah, a lack of affordable places for workers to live really is a drag on the entire economy. You know that when you have a worker who has to commute from way across the region, they're more likely to be late because transportation barriers, they're more likely to miss because they can't show up to their shift on time because they have to commute across a bridge that just isn't working. So transportation failure is connected. Then there's also just the lack of ability to attract folks from not only out of state, but within state or within the region. People generally want to live either close to where they work or with a dependable way to get to work. So if you're competing in a national marketplace or even a regional marketplace, you need to have someplace close by where people are able to afford. Working families shouldn't be forced to choose between putting food on the table, planning for their future, or paying rent. And far too often, it is not just the minimum wage workers, it is higher wage earners who are forced in this economy to make those choices. So these hard conversations have trickled all the way over to the government side. At Metro, we're having to confront the fact that some of our workers, we're bringing them up to $20 an hour, and that's the right thing to do. But we still know that a housing wage in the region is $26 an hour. So it's not something that we've nailed. It's not something that is going to be fixed by simply working on the housing side or simply working on the wage side. both have to come together. And Preston, I take your pessimism, and I'm normally an ER, so I take that critique really well, and I take it to heart. The fact that we are building regulated affordable housing that is hitting that 8 to 10%, that's what we need to do every year, and it's taken a lot of energy over the 5 years that we've done it to get there. But then that means we need to continue to put our foot on the gas for the rest of the market rate housing as well. There are opportunities to look at the edge of the region for new places to build housing. We've done that recently with a creative approach to a land swap where we've unlocked Tigard's River Terrace 2.0, which is a complete community. It's well planned for. Workforce housing requires planning. Not only does it require maybe incentives and motivation from government, workforce housing requires that it's planned to be workforce housing. So I would challenge all of my cities as they're working through what they want to see to think, where specifically do workers who work here want to live? So as we plan for workforce housing, I think that the deeply affordable units is something that we're going to continue to have government's responsibility, but the workforce housing broadly isn't only government's responsibility. We have to work better with our private sector developers.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in on that one? Or we'll move. Okay, good. We'll move on because we're out of time anyway.
Sorry.
No, that was perfect. Thank you for diving into that last question. Okay, I'd like to shift gears and talk about where we're going with workforce housing. And we'll start with Patrick Berry. And this is kind of a 2-3-part question, so feel free to answer it as you see fit. In terms of the overall housing market, where are we with trends, market rates, and the impact of affordable housing on the housing market? And then what should we be concerned about, and what should we be excited and enthusiastic about in the overall multifamily commercial housing market? That's a lot.
I'll try to tackle this one here. So again, my name is Patrick Berry. I'm an apartment appraiser. We just covered market rate housing. We don't dive into affordable housing. That's a whole different sector that I just don't touch. To give you an idea of the inventory across Portland Metro, we have about 280,000 apartment units. We've added about 60,000 of those units just in the past 8 years. So it's been a very active development cycle. For multifamily, the average rent across metro area is about $1.90 per square foot. Vacancy rates are currently about 5.5, but they're trending up. Just in this past year, we delivered 7,500 units, but at the same time, we only had absorption of about 2,000 units. So demand for housing is definitely down. As we've seen household formation slow down, we've seen population actually decline a little bit. And I know that we talk about long-term trends here of 36,000 units a year, but a developer is not thinking 10 years out. They're thinking 12 months down the road or 18 months down the road. They would love to look in a 10-year window, but they have to get permanent financing when that property stabilizes. And for someone who started a project in 2021 and they're finishing up in 2023, I mean, a lot of banks don't even exist anymore that they would have gone to. Rates are double or triple. And a lot of these developers right now are just trying to recoup the money they spent on their development. They're not worried about a profit anymore. So it's a really challenging market for market rate developers right now. It currently costs a market rate developer about $200,000 to maybe $275,000 to develop a unit. And then sales, the current median sales price on new units is right around $285,000. So if you do the math, the margin's pretty thin, and those costs I told you, there's no profit in there. That's just land costs, hard costs, and soft costs. And these values really have not increased in about 6 or 7 years. So it's a challenging market for developers. I know everybody wants to say they're greedy, but a lot of them are running on really thin margins right now, especially as interest rates push up. Cap rates also push up, which pushes down values. What I'm concerned about is, we see some shifting fundamentals. As I mentioned, interest rates or vacancy rates are increasing. Rents have actually declined about 5% in the past year. And market rate developers right now are just not incentivized. There's nobody out there rushing to get a project built because rates are triple what they were 3 years ago. And you have fundamentals that are really hard to come into market right now. So We've actually seen 5 quarters in a row of declining multifamily construction across Portland Metro, and I don't anticipate that to increase anytime soon. And as we talked about here, market rate housing is going to provide the vast majority of that 36,000 units. I mean, the public housing is wonderful, but that's not the main production of units. So that's what I'm concerned about. What I'm excited about is that some of these recommendations coming out of this council group, I'm not familiar with the name of the group, but just some of the ideas that have been thrown around, such as modular and prefabricated housing. It's really come a long ways. I recently appraised a 30-unit building, and it was all modular. And on day 1, they just had a foundation, and by day 3, they were up 3 stories. Completely finished project. All the units came finished, appliances installed, everything. And then it took them just a few more months to wrap up the project. There was talk about a pre-approved plans on a jurisdiction level, that if you agree to build this pre-approved plan without major deviations, that it can fly through approvals and not have this extremely long approval process. Talked about higher density zoning. I'm a huge fan of high density, of non-restrictive zoning to allow the developer to do what they do best. They're very efficient if they just have the right framework. And the last thing is, some of the urban growth boundary issues. I know it's a kind of a hot topic that I won't get into, but more supply is going to result in more affordable housing.
Thank you, Patrick. We'll shift over to Preston Korst. What are the potential barriers or challenges when trying to build affordable housing? I know Patrick touched on a little bit of that, but if you would add to it.
Yeah, so the hard part to describe is the fact that there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't one thing that can kill a project or make a project less affordable. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of things that can take a project from, feasible and financially viable for either an affordable developer or a private developer to basically non-existent and just a vacant lot, essentially. I think, so it depends on the jurisdiction and it depends on the situation. I think one portion of what is preventing a lot of housing from happening right now is the inflated costs right now for land and infrastructure. And Councilor Lewis touched on it, the investments in transportation and the roads, sewers, broadband, electrical wires and all that. That needs to happen, again, at a planning level, and it needs to happen early. But I also think that we need to reassess sort of how we think about the nature of how we build and where we build. So making sure that cities that do want to grow have the funding and resources to plot out a plan, concept plan, comprehensively plan for, a neighborhoods and an entire community that can bear 1,000 plus, 2,000, 3,000 plus units over time. So thinking long-term and making sure that we have enough land supply is a key issue for the home builders in our region that are developing those single-family, middle housing types, the quadplexes, duplexes, having enough land, because currently we don't have enough in our urban growth boundary. And that's just, from an economic standpoint, you're seeing the increasing cost to purchase land increase exponentially as we have sort of constricted that. So I think we do need to talk about how we invest in our resources for planning to make sure that cities that do want to build can. We're looking at Damascus. Anyone who knows the history of the city of Damascus, that's a great example of failed planning, essentially. So when I look at it, that's sort of a global perspective. Interest rates are always going to kill a project. That is something we don't have control over, but it is something that we're watching closely, and obviously we support lowering interest rates. And then another one, just small things, the site-specific things, like if you have a 5,000 square foot lot and you want to build a fourplex on it, which a lot of people in Portland want to do right now, and there's 1 or 2 trees that have a diameter of 36 inches. Hate to say it in Lake Oswego, but that alone, the costs and the tree code fees for removing those can make a project turn from feasible to non-feasible. So we have to look at the ecosystem of housing, but also like very site-specific things that local governments can do to incentivize more units and not just those one-off 5,000-6,000 square foot homes. So hope that answered it. I don't know if I did.
Thank you. No, I think we can see that there are a lot of challenges and barriers in affordable housing. It's complex. I'd like to open that question up to the other panelists if anyone else would like to jump in.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to pick up on the thread of the urban growth boundary, and that is something that I hear often, but just as much as we need to be looking at the edge and the outside, we need to be looking in. There was a developer who was looking to make use of essentially an open field, brownfield in Oregon City, 500 units mixed use. He needed about $20 million of public investment, which I believe would have been appropriate since the reason that the land was fallow was because of a previous public use. He went to the legislature hoping to find $20 million, did not get it. That project won't pencil without the public investment. So the opportunity to make these sorts of infill possible, I think, are oftentimes just as plausible. 20 million is probably a lot cheaper to get 500 units than if we had to build out a whole new comp plan at the edge of the region. So we need to be smart about where we're making our infill investments. And it's not about completing one project or another, I'll leave that to the professionals. It's about moving our whole system to the scale where all those projects can be happening at the same time. The pipeline, it's not just about lining things up in the pipe anymore, it's about getting a new pipe that is bigger and we can have more throughput. To that end, I also think we should be a little bit idealistic in working towards de-incentivizing empty units. We want to have full units. We want to make sure that we don't have vacancy rates. Naturally, the market brings us pretty low. Let's keep pushing on that. And then housing is an investment. Home ownership is really important. We're talking a lot about multifamily. Condoization is a really technically hard thing, and I'm not smart enough to explain why, but let's figure out how to make sure that people can have that slice of the American dream and that it's real people who are buying and not out-of-state or out-of-country investors. People who want to stay committed to our communities, our kids and future generations who will inherit that from us. I guess those are the barriers I can identify from the perspective of a regional government. Each individual city is going to have its own challenges, but I do think here in Lake Oswego, we're not the city of Portland. We don't have this fragmented, horrible bureau system where a permit gets kicked from one bureau to another. There's a single city hall, and somebody in planning can walk from one department to the other, or maybe even toss it over a cubicle. So with that, I'll hand it over to the City of Lake Oswego, because I'm optimistic that the suburbs are going to be where we're going to find some of our growth.
Absolutely, and thank you. We've actually had a really good opportunity to talk about this very topic recently through our work on the housing production strategy, where we've been interviewing various different producers of housing to kind of get a sense of what those barriers are within the city. And I'm not going to tell you anything that Preston and Councilor Lewis did not already mention. We've heard that obviously there's extremely high land costs within the city, limited ability for us to really control that as a city. Few large developable sites. We know that the city is primarily built out, at least on the suburban scale, but there are a lot of opportunities nonetheless within our city to really promote that development, really use that land a little bit more effectively and strategically. So we've heard a lot from those folks about code barriers that we have in Lake Oswego, and I think we'll have a lot of opportunity, as I've mentioned, to talk more about that and identify ways to potentially address those. They could be related to overlay and design district standards that can be relatively prescriptive, as well as architectural standards. In Lake Oswego, we do have a very high standard for construction, and there is a certain expectation that housing within this community would be held to a certain standard. But I think we're seeing that can be a bit of a barrier for developers, those standards. Going into process-related barriers as well, I think we've seen that there can be added time for those sort of more complex standards, particularly related to overlay districts. Just more prescriptive standards really aren't getting the outcomes that we know that as a city we need. So again, going to continue to plug our work on the housing production strategy in the next year or so, where we can talk more in depth about different things that we could address within zoning within the city that could overcome these barriers.
I agree with everything that's been said. I also want to talk about the financing side. Oregon as a whole, as a state, has suffered a lot of reputational damage in the past 5 years. ULI, the Urban Land Institute, I think in 2018 we were the #1 potential location. They ranked us #1 for opportunity for investment. We moved to 2023 and we've dropped down to like 41. And a lot of that reason is there's a lot of people, big owners, big investors, big developers that are really nervous to invest here because something like rent control can be, introduced at one point, and 5 years later the bar changes here. And it's not like they've sold the property; they still own the property, and it's made a lot of investors and lenders just rule out Oregon as a whole. They say it's too risky of a state. They change the rules on a whim, and we just no longer want to invest there. And on the single-family side, it's often local developers, local builders. But when you get to the multifamily projects that are 50 million plus, there's no money from Oregon. It's all money from outside Oregon that come to invest here. Actually, 47 of our top 50 buyers of multifamily are from outside Oregon. So while we like to think of it as kind of a local market, it's a national, international market. And I think as we increase regulation, we're just shutting off more people from potentially investing here.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's shift then to solutions, because I think we've touched on the barriers and challenges, and we've hinted at solutions in different ways. I'll start with Councilor Christine Lewis and then open up to the group. Are there any innovative tools, actions, policies, or incentives that cities or organizations are taking to build affordable housing?
Sure, absolutely. So I've talked about the bond that we've done at Metro. It was only the second bond for housing at a municipal level in Oregon. The first one was in 2016 in the city of Portland. So it's old, but it's still innovative, and I'm not sure that we're going to do another bond on top of it, but I do think that we need to be open and put everything on the table about how to continue to fund deeply affordable housing. We also use tax increment financing and obviously a lot of the federal incentives for tax credits. With that work, we need to continue to advocate at the federal level for more private activity bond allocation. More than half the states in the country are oversubscribed. We're one of them. And without that, that's going to be a barrier to continuing that pipeline. Again, it's not the silver bullet to just build the deeply regulated, but if we stall there, naturally occurring affordable housing becomes less frequent. Then we also need to continue to look at the SDC conversation. I know Lake Oswego and Happy Valley in my district are having those conversations. Washington County's had them. I think that's pretty important, and helps also make sure that we're streamlining our process to support private developers. I want to make sure that everything that we do at the regional level supports smaller communities with the tools that they need. We cannot just rely on Portland, Hillsborough, and the bigger cities. And I think that when I'm looking at tools and policies, it really is this next urban growth report that's going to be really significant at the metro level about what land becomes available and how we are thoughtful in our planning. We need to make sure that we have readiness. Preston talked a little bit to what we've learned out of Damascus, but a city that is ready, that is planful, that is ready to put in the infrastructure. That's absolutely necessary from a metro perspective.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in on innovative tools, actions, and policies?
I guess I would just share that, as much as it would be comforting to think that there is just some secret tool out there, some innovative thing that we could do to really solve this problem, it seems as though that only one strategy will never be enough. We're going to have to look at a variety of different strategies in combination these things work often as systems and individual sort of components of a system. So we really can't look at anything in isolation. And I would just mention that when we've seen housing get constructed, particularly income-restricted affordable housing, it's often as a result of several of those tools being employed for oftentimes just one project. So I would just mention that we're going to have to do quite a little bit more of a scattershot approach to really make sure that we're meeting those needs, just to make sure that we're not missing out on any of the opportunities that might be out there. And of course, going to continue to mention that we have lots of opportunities to talk about this in the next year or so, and we'll actually be talking with our city council in Lake Oswego about different approaches that we could employ to start to get a little bit more innovative in Lake Oswego for housing production. So we'll be talking about that with city council next week on November 7th. So really starting to dive into those details pretty quickly in Lake Oswego.
So I often think about what can cities do, and cities really are the place, the bread and butter of where local housing decisions are made. But there is a Housing Production Advisory Council happening through the governor's action. There are about 25 developers on that committee, in addition to legislators and some bureaucrats. But essentially they've developed 25 solid recommendations that the legislature can implement, but I encourage all of our local cities, and Lake Oswego being one, to look at what they've recommended and produced. It's everything from wetland mitigations to financing opportunities and taxing and design review. And I mean, there's no short, there's 25 pure experts on that committee. I'd encourage cities to look at that and say, which of those can we implement through policy alone? Another thing that as we look at a regional bond and sort of in addition to record investments happening at the federal level and potentially the state level, and I see the city manager of Lake Oswego here, don't throw any darts at me, but what are some of the opportunities that cities can do to reduce the tax burdens on developers and homeowners? So some people are talking about having pure tax abatements for all new construction, property tax abatements that is, or seriously looking at having regional, state, and federal funding going to defray the costs of SDCs, in addition to using tax increment financing in a more pro-housing way that doesn't just produce the streets and lighting, but also maybe defray some of the costs to actually install the necessary infrastructure for residential housing. So those are some people would call them outlandish ideas that may impact a city's bottom line, but they, in the long run, they could have the potential to increase the city's budgets overall, because currently right now, a lot of vacant lots are just sitting there. And if a city is willing to forego some of that immediate revenue from development, then they eventually will attract more builders into their area. Long term, they'll be boosting their own revenue. So it's a little bit financing, but it's a little bit land, it's a little bit design review and permitting. Like we said, I think we said it a dozen times now, there's no silver bullet, but we should be looking at everything right now.
I had a few ideas on this one. I think we need to move away from always discussing in negative terms about the word developer. They're going to be a private developers. They're the ones that are going to kind of move us forward with the housing. I think if some of these municipalities can offer some true incentives, developers, they want to get out there and they want to build. They just need the numbers to work. I did some work on a project up in Vancouver. It was a private developer out of Portland, and they went to Vancouver because Vancouver was offering a 10-year tax abatement on the improvements, full abatement, so they only paid taxes on the land if the developer agreed to keep rents, or to only rent to people who were made under 120% of the median family income, and then kept rents at the affordable levels that HUD prescribes for that unit. And they went there and developed probably 80 to 100 units at their cost, which is closer to $200,000 to $225,000 per unit. And I pulled up some of the projects that were discussed earlier, and I know there's a lot more that goes into it. You can't just compare market rate in public. But most of those units cost over $400,000 a unit. So just the efficiency on the market side is there. You just need to provide the right carrots for some of these developers to move forward on these affordable units, because they really do want to build. And right now is a great time because everybody's slowing down. I mean, there's no new units going up right now. But if a developer has some kind of incentive to get out there and build, I think they would. Also, some of the restrictive zoning, a lot of multifamily developers, they don't know retail, they don't know ground floor commercial. And when there's requirements to build ground floor commercial, they just shy away from those zones completely. And there's a lot of cities out there that have commercial zones that require ground floor retail, and it's just not there. It's not, a lot of multifamily developers just don't know it. And then restrictive zoning, limiting densities. I think when you have low density limits, you encourage big, huge units that have big, huge rents. And when you get some of these higher density zones, you're going to get people that build smaller units that are just, less expensive rents. So if we can encourage that, and then sometimes you'll allow a certain density, and then you go and look at the zoning, and it requires a setback of 20 feet all around and 30 feet here, and a height limit of X, and 1.5 parking spaces per unit. And you start doing the math, and there's just no way you can build to the maximum. It's called the floor area ratio, FAR. There's no way you can build to the maximum FAR when you consider all the parking and landscaping requirements and bike parking and everything else. It's just really hard to get there. So I think taking a close look at the zoning, like you were saying with the tree, there may be small portions of that zoning that's holding you back from getting better use of the land. And then some of the other stuff, which I don't think would deliver a large number of units, but it helps with the ADUs, kind of the infill housing, the middle housing, modular, prefabricated. More public-private partnerships where maybe we can bring that cost down somewhere between the public and the private side and get a little better bang for your buck. So that's what I have.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our moderated portion of this seminar, and I'd like to open up, we've got about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. We'll just get started. John?
Patrick?
Yeah.
For everybody, the state is saying we need 36,000 units per year. What's the chance of that happening? I'd like everybody to comment on, is that really going to happen?
No, unless there's a huge carrot put out there. It's really hard. I mean, we had a great run of the economy with population growth, and we maxed out at about 10, I'm just talking multifamily here, and this is actually just Portland Metro, but that accounts for a large percentage. We topped out at 10,000 units developed in 1 year, and that was the highest number of units that we've ever built since the 1970s. The last time we did that was the 70s, but yet our population has doubled. And in the 70s, there were a couple of years where we exceeded 9,000 apartment units. Yet our population doubles and we don't exceed 9,000 again until 2018. And the only reason we did that year is because inclusionary housing was going into effect, and every developer rushed to beat the deadline on inclusionary housing. So reaching 36, I think, is really optimistic, unless the rules change.
I'd like to answer that too. I think, and I might break out in hives because I'm going to say something a little bit more optimistic than I usually do, but I would say now is the first time I think that many of us in this room have seen every elected official and government staff and private developers and just sort of the community rowing in the same direction when it comes to housing production. And if every single jurisdiction does do its part, the governor, I think, is incredibly pro-housing, and we've seen it in middle housing development or middle housing legislation that she's done in the past. But with that Housing Production Advisory Council, there are some bold solutions and bold opportunities that the state could go after. There are record investments that are happening at the federal level to support infrastructure, and a lot of jurisdictions are actually voluntarily. City of Portland, don't count them out. City of Portland is going after a voluntary housing regulatory relief project right now to scale back some of their well-intentioned housing regulations, which hopefully will produce that. But that's for me to say, everyone appears to be rowing in the same direction, which may eventually get us there in the next decade, let's say, hopefully.
I'm a pessimist by nature. As I said earlier, I'm the ER, so no, not immediately. But it depends on how you cut that up. There are 36 counties, so what if every county did 1,000? That's unrealistic for Lake County. It's totally achievable for Clackamas County. So depending on how you slice it up, what our regional share is, I think we can get there. And if you were to say, based on our population of Portland metro area, should be around 14,000, 13,000. We're not going to get there in year 1, year 2, but we might get there in the next couple of years.
Thank you. Erik, did you have anything to add, and then we'll move on?
Just more pessimism, but that's right.
Patrick, you mentioned that the market rate for developers is around 200,000, 240,000 a unit, and with all the additional costs for affordable housing, that's somewhere around 400,000 a unit, because you've got, a lot of. Is there any way, and this is between you and Metro Councilor Christine, is there any way to contract with developers to provide that affordable housing at the 200 to 240,000 per door cost?
I'll go first. So the opportunity to contract with private developers, that's what we do. The Merrillhurst property is being built by Walsh, and Walsh plays in both spaces. When we build regulated affordable housing, there are layers of regulation that are on there in terms of ADA access and some things that I think are pretty non-negotiable in terms of making those units available to anybody in our community. So that automatically adds to some of those costs. But in terms of one of the best ways I see to lower the cost per unit is to lower the barrier to entry in affordable housing. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in Central Oregon where they promoted a project that they were so proud to having built. It had 46 different funding sources. So by the time you put together that finance stack, you've paid a lot of lawyers, a lot of hours over a lot of years. One of the ways that private developers save money is by having all their money in their pocket or their banking lined up. They get their property, they start the permitting process. But we take 2 or 3 years before we even get to that permitting desk. So we've got to have projects that require 1 or 2 or 3 sources, not 46.
I'm not going to step out of my line here and try and comment on the cost of affordable. I do know that there are some projects in the city of Portland where a public source approached the developer at the 11th hour, when they were maybe 90% complete with construction, and they negotiated a price to buy the properties. And that, again, there's not going to be the services in place. They're not going to have the say in what goes where and what's available on the ground floor in terms of support. But it was a project that worked for them, and they approached them. And I think they paid a market rate price. They used a broker here in town, and I think they paid a fair price for it. And then it was purchased by a public entity and went affordable. So I know there's a lot of developers right now that are really scared. And if somebody approached them and said, before you start stabilizing, could I consider buying this property? Boy, they'd be all ears and definitely listening. So.
We had a question in the back. Was it it? We'll start with you, sir.
Okay, all right. I did want to ask a Buffalo what you think of your new football coach, but we won't go there. I do think there's a silver bullet. And I'm going to go on to Patrick's comment about reputational damage that Oregon suffers. Whether it's at the local level, the regional level, or the state level, state officials need to figure out how not to beat private enterprise over the head with a damn stick. I've had the opportunity to work and grow a large business in Portland, build several structures, and I don't think Portland or Oregon is a model at all that's going to get where we want to get. I would encourage the 3 of you that have jurisdictional jobs to go to Europe, go to Canada, go to Australia, and see how their governments work with private enterprise. And you'll see what, as Erik pointed out, public-private partnerships, they don't work here in the U.S. because because the political process, to Christine's point, you have to line up all the lawyers to get everything done. So the message is, you know, private enterprise isn't out here to take your money and run. Patrick noted the thin margins that developers work on. Respect that, and respect the risk that they take in that project. And I couldn't be more emphatic about that. And I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about ways to do that.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, so Patrick, you might know the number better, but inclusionary zoning was passed in Portland, and I believe year over year new building permits declined by about 60% due to feasibility issues. I know you had mentioned maybe including inclusionary zoning in Lake Oswego, obviously rent control, plenty of documentation that shows that's counterproductive to development. How do you balance public policy while also incentivizing private development and investment?
Yeah, you know, I would say that we've heard similar concerns about sort of a more widespread mapping of inclusionary housing or mandatory affordable inclusionary. You know, in Lake Oswego, we have actually mapped that for specific sites. Generally, when we do know that there is a motivated developer there that is committed to providing units, and we work with the property owner and the developers to sort of facilitate that. So we haven't taken the approach where we've mapped it more widely and required a certain percentage of affordable units. And again, we will have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that, but we have heard similar things to what you're mentioning about how that can have a bit of a stifling effect on overall housing development.
Yeah, just look at Portland.
If I want to jump in there for a minute. I do think that there was a huge run-up, record number of units up to inclusionary housing. So trying to compare it based on the drop, leading up to inclusionary housing is really hard. And I think there was also, rents flattened out at that time, values flattened out. That's when, 2018, 1920s when construction costs really started ramping up. So I think it's hard to just point to inclusionary housing and say that's the reason for it. I think you had rent control, a lot of things went into place at that time. But I've seen, developers are concerned about it, but there's a ton of workarounds and, not great workarounds, but they put up freestanding 19-unit buildings instead of doing a 20-unit building. Rather than doing like 6 studios, they do 1 4-bedroom unit that's got no living room and no dining room and just all bedrooms. They do goofy stuff to get around it. But also keep in mind that when those inclusionary housing, those rents are set at a region, at a metro level. And I even brought that in now. The affordable rent, the quote unquote affordable rent at 60% affordable. A 2-bedroom unit is $1,525, a 1-bedroom unit is $1,269, and a studio is $1,185. So that's not really what all this, that'd be more than market rate if you go out to like East County. Downtown Portland, that might be a little bit less than market rate, but they're not. So their bottom line is impacted. It's not a huge impact, but it's definitely not bringing anybody to Portland. It's not an incentive by any means, but some people are making it work. There are some workarounds, and also sometimes when you do the math, the impact is minimal on some of these units. But I don't want to give it. It's also not producing that many units, so I don't want to point just to that and say that's the reason.
No, it's culmination.
Yes, it's a culmination. It didn't help.
Right.
So.
All right, we can take one more question and then we'll be out of time.
Speaking specifically to the density with different solutions for housing, where are we at with like casitas or mother-in-law dwellings for property that's already existing? Not for VRBOs or vacation rentals, but for longer term rentals?
Well, I think from my perspective, I have to look at regional. I don't know if you're talking about Lake Oswego specifically, but if you're talking about what was allowed, what wasn't allowed prior to 2019, which was when that housing bill passed, to today, there isn't a lot of data on it. But overall, I think in the city of Portland, the last year, 2 years, between the units that weren't allowed, between today that were actually constructed, there are about 1,000 units that have been built in the city of Portland, which is good, and it's impressive. I think infill works better in Portland than it does in most other jurisdictions, particularly in the outer rings of the urban growth boundary. So it's good. A lot of those have been fourplexes, which we've been encouraged to see, and a lot of them have been those ADUs, because those ADUs for the city of Portland and a couple other jurisdictions, they don't require system development charges. So builders can build them a lot more cheaply than they would be able to if they're tearing their house down and building a duplex, for instance. So it's going well. I don't think it is. It's one piece, an important piece of the equation, and it will likely grow as builders see how that works and sort of get more familiar with the product and get more, and jurisdictions, more importantly, are more comfortable with permitting those in a more regular and quick fashion.
And I will say that bill passed in 2019, and we still have some of our smaller cities who are yet to adopt their final code. So that's how long policy takes, particularly at a city level, where you have to not only work with the city council, but also a planning commission, a group of volunteers who probably meet once a month. So the opportunity to make sure that when we have state level standards, that they take into account that most cities are not like the city of Portland. Most cities are going to take time to put their policy into place.
Yeah, and I would just point out, here in Lake Oswego, we do have a policy to waive SDC fees for accessory dwelling units if they're not being used as short-term rentals. So that's something that we're doing here in the city. But yeah, just to echo these comments, it is fairly untested in terms of the market. It's fairly new. So there's a lot of interest, I would say, though, in Lake Oswego to take on some of these mother-in-law units, as you say, or accessory dwelling units where you could rent out a separate unit in your from your primary residence, of course. And middle housing did open that up to be a little bit more flexible, but there's still more that can be done to allow sort of a little bit more flexibility with siting for accessory dwelling units. But we're seeing a bit of that, but just in terms of the overall scale, I mentioned there's 34 middle housing units in the last year. A lot of those were ADUs, but that's compared to 754 multifamily units in the city. So it is a sort of small portion at the moment, and we hope it does increase over time, though.
All right, thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for attending. We also want to invite you to attend our 2024 Spring Cruiseway Economic Forum in April. We are working on a speaker to discuss artificial intelligence and how it is transforming the future of business. And with that, we'll conclude our seminar today. Thank you all for coming.